Okay, from our studios this week in Los Angeles and Tampa, this is Green Tag Theme Park in 30. I'm Philip, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Scott Swenson of Scott Swenson Creative Development. Before we get rolling into the news today, just one announcement that we do have bonus episodes. If 30 minutes is not enough and you want to hear us get even more unhinged as the coffee wears off, then there are bonus episodes available where we kind of start the recording as soon as the main recording finishes. That's going to be available on Spotify and I believe iTunes relatively soon, and Patreon. So I'll put links to those. You can subscribe for a monthly fee to get access to bonus episodes.
Sometimes it can get pretty dicey. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
So Philip and I just in full transparency, Philip and I just had a 2-hour-long conversation before we started shooting this, which we did not record because we're idiots. But yeah, when we get wound up on stuff, if you hear either of us sort of sitting on our hands or moving on, the bonus stuff is exactly where that comes out, where we get to talk about, wait a minute, we didn't say that thing in the show. Boy, I wish we'd said that. So, It's much, I will say, I think it's fair to say it is much less polished. It is much less professional, but it is, you'll learn a bit more about both Philip and I and where we stand on things.
If you really want to know what we think about something, go to the subscribe to the bonus content. That's what I'm going to say, because we got to be polished here, but less polished there. And those will be up shortly, so you all can get access to those. Also, we don't have a plan for this at all, so I think especially in the Patreon, where there's ability for you guys to comment, we will be taking suggestions for topics.
Absolutely. Yeah. And if there's something you want us to talk about with the gloves off, put those in those comments, and we will do everything we can to make that work for you. So
today's episode is mostly going to be related to the 2023 Global Attractions attendance stuff. This is a report that the TEA and AECOM release every year. It's kind of the benchmark kind of industry standard for understanding the global attractions industry. It's a lot. Again, so I recommend you, if you want to look at the graphs, everything. It's about 80 pages. So what I did was I looked through everything and I took out the bits I thought were most relevant for our audience. We're only going to look at the theme park section. It does also cover museums and zoos and aquariums and FECs, and it looks at every individual region plus the global industry, and it looks at a lot of data, a lot of materials. I would suggest, if you're interested in any of that you just look at the report. It's free download, so you can download it yourself and look at that. But we'll just hone in on just this one segment, which is the theme park segment. And we will primarily be talking about North America because that's where a lot of our, where we both live. So we just kind of talking about that.
There's that.
I
have to start by saying, all of you, I just want you to whisper quietly as you're listening. Thank you, Philip, because Scott never would have dug into all of this, all of this detail. And Philip thrives on this kind of thing. So kudos to Philip, and thank you for putting it into a digestible format for me first, and then for all of you.
Well, okay. Well, I will read basically excerpts from it, little excerpts. And overall, though, if I'm going to TLDR this whole episode, Scott and I told you so is the TLDR for all of this, because I feel like nothing in here isn't something we've already discussed in some fashion. And you will hear a lot of the same things we've talked about, but echoed in here. But it's good that someone with real knowledge validates our yammerings. So I appreciate this. The report starts off by just straight up saying that 2023 marked a turning point for the global attractions industry because pandemic-related operating restrictions are gone and attractions could turn their attention from recovery and focus on the future. This year, the report returned to the normal process of ranking. The industry has basically returned to its pre-pandemic position. So that's kind of how they start off, and we've talked about that ad nauseum, about how this is the 2023 is our finally reset year. So that's the first portion. Generally, parks that invested regularly throughout the pandemic years tended to perform better over time. Gee, that sounds familiar. Asian parks, most dramatically affected by pandemic restrictions, showed great year-over-year rebounds, but it remains to be seen if the great growth of the Asian market that we saw pre-pandemic will continue in coming years. We've also talked about this. So we've talked about not only the concept of investing even while your park is closed, which Scott talked about extensively,
Way
especially
too
with
much. Yeah,
way too much. Yep. But also the concept that Asia recently reopened, so on paper the numbers look ridiculous. But their point about like the Asia economies are not as recovered. I mean, they're not saying this. I'm saying this. The Asia economies are not as recovered, as the U.S. because our economy is relatively recovered for the G7, but China especially struggling. So again, remains to be seen, right? How much of the number rebound is their revenge travel? How much of how will spending be sustained? That's why they put in here remains to be seen. And the last point, of course, is Six Flags Cedar Fair completed a merger in 2024. The newly formed company, now the largest regional amusement park operator in the Americas by number of parks, have a combined 2023 attendance that would rank fifth in the world, but still under some of these other park operators, which I think is also something we've talked about with just this dichotomy, right? Where like they have the most parks in the Americas all combined together, and they still can't beat Disney and Universal and Fanta Wild and Merlin, right? I mean, that's kind of like that's interesting, right? So, but we've talked about that too,
right. And I think just to pause on that for a second, I think what that shows to me is not necessarily, gosh, they're sucking wind. What it says to me is there's a great deal of potential here because this merger is relatively new. They haven't really been able to parlay the number of parks and the buying power that they now have into expanded marketing. I would definitely keep my eye on this company because they now have, they have a lot more crayons in their box than they've ever had before as individual companies. So keep an eye on it because it's not to say, haha, look, they've got all these parks and they still can't make all the revenue. What it really says to me, at least, is look at the opportunity they have here to continue to grow. I think it's also important to point out that not vast majority, but the majority, I believe, a large number, I haven't fact checked this. A large number of these parks are seasonal, based on where they are in the country. So it's also important to recognize that we are comparing. When you start comparing Disney does not have seasonal parks in Florida or California, and so we have to factor that in as well. However, Fanta Wild and Merlin do have seasonal parks. So
yeah. I agree. I think I like the phrase remains to be seen, right? I think that is exactly it for both of these. Like, will this approach of having a lot of different parks all over an area, all of the Americas, help to diversify so that if there's bad weather in one area, then you still have, 13 parks. It doesn't matter if there's hurricanes. You got so many parks, parks coming out of every which way. So it's a little diversification, and if they're able to extend their IPs like they're trying with Halloween to really drive interest in regions that don't have any IP representation at all, I think that could be I just think, to me, what's most interesting is, much like with the problems, I don't want to say problems, but kind of the American market where you have a shrinking middle class. That's, to me, what it looks like. It reminds me of where you have Disney, and then even under it you have Universal, and then you kind of have everybody else kind of struggling for. So it's just, to me, it seems disproportionate, I guess is more what I meant. More like disproportionate attention at the like the big parks have a lot of attention, and everyone else kind of has much less than that. But
and let's not forget that Six Flags tried to do this on their own once before. Six Flags went through and this was early 2000s. Was it early 2000s? Where they basically went on a buying spree and they bought up tons and tons and tons and tons of parks. And then after they had bought up tons and tons and tons and tons of parks, they had no capital money to bring those parks up to standard, or up to even the Six Flags standard at the time. So they ended up selling off many of those parks. So, it remains to be seen. I think that this approach makes more sense to me than let's just buy up all the independent parks that happen to be for sale, because both Six Flags and Cedar Fair have had a recognizable quality level, and so it will be interesting. I think there is, once again, the phrase I'm going to keep using is there's a great deal of potential here, and we'll see how they take advantage of that.
Well, I already hinted at this, but let's talk about the numbers, which is the next section of the report. Magic Kingdom continued as the world's most visited theme park last year, drawing a reported 17.7 million visitors. So again, that's just 1 year, 17.7 million. However, Disneyland in California trailed by less than 500,000 visitors, with Universal Studios Osaka in Japan coming in third with 16 million. So very, very close. It also mentioned that a theme park in the Middle East appeared on the index attendance list for the first time this year, with Warner Brothers World Abu Dhabi making the top 20 list in the EMEA region. And the key here is that the Yas Island theme park drew 1.75 million visitors in 2023, which just opened in May. So like that's only like 6-7 months, and they saw 1.75 million visitors at the Yas Island region. So that's, again, you think of the time lag in this. So these are 2023 numbers, but we're already almost through 2024, so it's a time lag. So I think their point in that is that there's a lot of potential there for growth, and we're not sure how quickly that region is going to grow, but that's a lot. I mean, 1.75 million already puts them ranking in the top 20, and it was just half a year.
Right. I think the important thing to recognize is and again, I only say this because I was there for a while and had a chance to actually not just look at the numbers, but live it. Yas Island is ready for very large numbers of tourists. They have invested the money to build all of the parks on Yas Island, which, just to put things into perspective, Yas Island is sort of like a Walt Disney World, but it's not. Well, it is all owned by the same company, but it's not. It's not necessarily. It doesn't appear to be. So you've got Warner Brothers, you've got SeaWorld, you've got Yas Water World, and you've got Ferrari World. So you've got 4 different parks in one very close area, really within walking distance of each other. They are working on transportation to get you from one to the other. There are hotels located throughout Yas Island. It is all concentrated in one part of Abu Dhabi. So they're ready. So this number actually doesn't surprise me, simply because they built it not necessarily because they had to, or not necessarily in a way that they had to expand it as needed. They built it to accommodate a very large group of people. The challenge that they're going to have, I think, is operationally, but that's a whole nother story and probably a whole nother show. But when it comes to the hard goods and the queues, the available hotel rooms, the surrounding restaurants, and yes, bars, because Yas Island does have the ability to get alcohol, which the rest of the UAE or much of the UAE does not have at the moment. It's ready. It's ready for tourism, and if the floodgates were to open, from a hard goods standpoint, they could take it all. They'd still, just like Walt Disney World when it first opened, because I attended Walt Disney World as a child, and they were not ready from an operational standpoint to get the deluge of guests that they got. Yeah. They had some harsh learning curves that they had to learn. But I will say that the government in the UAE is very interested in continued training, and I know that because I've written some courses for the Middle East. But they're very interested to continue training so that they can address this problem, quote unquote, when it happens. I mean, we all say, what a terrible problem when you all of a sudden get too many guests that you don't know quite how to handle from an operational standpoint. That can be fixed. And can be fixed relatively quickly. What's much harder is to fix it if you built a park that can only take in 100 guests a day and you have 1,000. That's a much bigger problem. That is not the problem on Yas Island.
We will talk about that soon, because I think that same idea of the preparation for Yas Island is a interesting thing later as you look at some of the numbers. So top 10 companies: Disney, Fanta Wild, Merlin, Universal, Chimelong, which is maybe for our US listeners a little surprising. If you look at the top parks here, they have like a nice world map, and they also have like a picture of a little charts of the top parks. So we have Magic Kingdom, Disneyland, Universal Studios Japan, Tokyo Disneyland, Shanghai Disney are the top 5. And then just again, just giving the location here, just so if you look at where the top 10 theme parks in the world are located, you have Florida, California, Japan, China, Japan, Florida, France, Florida. So it's just very interesting that it's like there is so much in the Asia region, which I think they hinted at, but I think again, that was going to be the next theme park capital. So it's just especially with the recovery of Japan and all that area. It's just, there's a lot of people in those markets, and just like there's a lot of people in the Middle East. And I think with when that, like to Scott's point, when it gets gearing up, I mean, this is all just so interesting to me when you think about the context, especially of the D23 and how much they're investing in Florida. And I think it might be exactly to Scott's point about like, so I'm getting ahead of myself.
D23, they're shooting where the ducks are flying.
So let's put a pin in that. But if you look at the top parks, right? So Magic Kingdom, 17.7 million, Disneyland, 17.2 million.
Now, Philip,
But how much larger is Magic Kingdom than Disneyland?
Well, and when you say Magic Kingdom, what I don't see, again, being a Floridian, what I don't see is Epcot, Animal Kingdom, Disney Studios.
Those are on the list, yes.
They are on the list, but they are considered separate individual parks.
Correct. And they're much further down the list.
Yes, no, I understand that. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, I just think that it's those things are the most interesting to me. And you actually, when you look at this, I think D23 makes a lot of sense because Magic Kingdom, again, 17.7 million. The next one, to Scott's point, would be Epcot at only 11 million. So if they're already pushing in like 6 million people more in Magic Kingdom, then why not expand it? And if they have the room in the infrastructure, to Scott's point about the Yas Island, then why not? To me, what's astounding is that Disneyland at its size is able to put through that many people. I mean, it is so much smaller than Magic Kingdom, and they're able to put through that many people. I mean, it's no wonder it's that capacity, and that it's completely landlocked. And same thing with Universal Studios Japan. I mean, that was shocking to me that USJ is the number 3 park.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it shouldn't be shocking because we're in this industry, but when you look at the numbers, like 16 million, that's a small park. That's a tiny park. And they're putting through 16 million. I mean, it's really an argument, I think, for just places that have a density of people. We look at Tokyo as well, 15 million. I mean, so
where does California Adventure fall? Since they're separating out the Disney parks and the locations.
Yeah, much further down the list. It's number 11 because it's only posting 10 million.
Okay. So Epcot is beating California Adventure.
Yeah.
The thing to take into consideration here is when you take Disneyland and California Adventure and add them together, because let's face it, that would be a guest.
It wouldn't even, if you add all that together, it's not even as big as Magic Kingdom.
If you add what all together?
If you add Disneyland and Disney California Adventure together, they're not the size of Magic Kingdom.
Correct. But what I'm saying, my point being is you've got, I think it is interesting that
I guess land size is what I meant. They're not the land size. So I see your point where you're splitting out each park. And I'm just saying, I'm like, that's crazy to me that like, it's such a small amount of space looking at these two parks that are literally within walking distance of each other versus like Magic Kingdom and Epcot where you have to take a shuttle or a transit I mean, they're not within
Correct.
walking distance of each other.
Correct. But if we're looking at it from a tourism standpoint, and I'm not sure how this breaks down. You've looked at the numbers, but how much are local, how much are tourists, whatever. But if you're looking at it from a tourism standpoint, what you really need to do, if you're looking at these locations as far as numbers, is to look at all the parks in the location. So take Disneyland and California Adventure and put those numbers together, and then take Magic Kingdom, Epcot, Animal Kingdom, and Disney Studios.
Yeah.
And probably the water parks as well, and add those all together because each one of those is a separate click of admission.
Correct. We do have the worldwide map does give us those numbers, so I can tell you. And also the other thing to keep in mind here. So D23 makes a lot more sense. First of all, if you look at, again, shooting where the ducks are flying, to Scott's point, there's already 17 million people going into Magic Kingdom. And so they're like, we'll just kind of put more excitement there. And you look at DCA, that's where they have some announcements of expansions in California and what. So you look at that makes sense. It is puzzling to me a little bit that they're not banking more on the Asia market, but they might be just waiting to see how sustained this is going to be in Asia versus the Middle East and how that's going to play out. And they know, again, that people are going to go to Disney, to Magic Kingdoms, might as well just build more stuff there to get more people in, because ostensibly they could fit more there than they can at Disneyland. Because I can't imagine you could
Yeah.
double the Disneyland attendance. That's
You
wild.
have to look at where do you have room for expansion?
Yeah.
You don't
And they have room there.
You've got tiny little parks. You've got USJ, and so that explains why, not a whole lot of the parks are small.
Yep.
The parks are small. Disneyland and USJ are small, and so there's not room for expansion there.
Yep. So,
but then when you go to the worldwide map, because I just scrolled down, I cheated, and you look at Florida, which is
68. Yeah. So
68.5 versus California, which is 36.9.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was my point in adding the parks together, because there are people who only come to Walt Disney World in Florida thinking that it's Magic Kingdom.
Yep.
Which is way wrong. But that's all they can budget.
Yep. Yeah. I think a lot of these, it's just so interesting, again, to look at the combination of those, like to Scott's point. So in ranking, it would go the Florida area with almost 70 million visitors in 23. And keep in mind that's still a little bit modulating, right? Like there's still, that's even without weather and with all the other things people say was slowing attendance and everything. But so you look at Florida, and then the next one would be China with 50 million and 6 parks. So Florida with 6 parks and also roughly 70 million. And then China with also 6 parks and roughly 50 million. And then you would actually go to Japan, which only has 3 parks, but averages 43 million, right? And then California, which has 3 parks and 36 million. So those are your big regions, right? And then if you really look at everything else, it's so much less than those numbers. Like then you're dropping down to 16 million for France. And so, yeah, there definitely are hubs. And if you kind of look at these hubs, you see the D23 announcements kind of almost aligning very well, with these, I think with the exception really of China. And I think that's just because Disney doesn't have as much of a footprint there. I mean, all those are Chimelong, right. It's not.
I was just going to say, the reason they're not looking at those is because they don't have full ownership of those.
Correct. Yep. And then if you look at the announcements, right, from Universal, it also, you see, right, Epic, where's that going? In the main hub, right? And then beyond that, they're looking at expansions into some of the other underserved market, and potentially they're banking on this EMEA, or they're banking on the UK region, which doesn't really have any competition, but they must have identified potential competition there. So, or potential, the only one they list there is like Europa Park in that whole region, but Europa Park and then Efteling. So, so that's the numbers. Looking at spending, in stark contrast with the rest of the world, attendance at North American theme parks was somewhat stagnant for 2023, showing a collective and modest increase of about 3% for 2022. In other time periods, a 3% gain would be applauded, but North American parks fell short of fully regaining their 2019 pre-pandemic attendance. Much of this was likely tied to predicted declines in levels of pent-up demand, slower than expected return of international visitors, and the timing of and levels of investment in new attractions. Per capita spending has been steadily increasing, a trend continuing from the first few quarters when parks reopened from the pandemic. The secret seems to be putting focus on the guest experience and finding ways to translate that into more spending. Some of this increase likely comes from being in an inflationary market, which I was going to say, and then they put it in the report, and I was like, oh, good. Also from an increased number of transactions. So it's like they make it sound like it's rocket science here, but about just increasing the spending, But what's interesting is that, this is a good point here, which is the slower than expected return of international visitors. And that is most likely due to the dollar being so strong as compared to other visitors. And so Orlando relies heavily on international visitors. And so I think you could also see, again, back to the investment in Orlando, when the other places start to recover, international tourism does return, you could see all of those parks get a bump from that international return to tourism. Whereas California is not going to see that bump because like that's not as much of a market in California for that.
Right. Right.
Yeah, but that bump could also, again, remains to be seen. How much tourism will return to China remains to be seen, right? So will that bump? Yeah, where will that bump? We see that manifest?
Well, kind of going back to the "we told you so" comment that Philip made at the beginning. Um, one of the things that we said very, very early on was, when we come out of the pandemic, we are not going to go back to the way things were. We are going to go forward to the way things are going to be. And I think that's what we're discovering right now. Everybody keeps making these comparisons because that's what financial people do, is make the comparisons to 2019 when we didn't have a pandemic. There's so many factors that aren't being figured in there, that how the pandemic changed the way we live, and how the pandemic changed what we like to do, and the importance that we put on family, and the importance we put on things that we do together. And I think we're still learning that. I think we are equaling out. I do. I really think we are kind of finding that median, which I think will be great. But I think that we have to look forward to find out where we're going, just as much as we are looking backward to compare us to 2019. That's my point.
Well, I have no response to that. I think, if anything, I think some of their trends, they say, do look forward. But again, their trends, I think we've been talking about. One trend I didn't really put in here, but maybe speaks to Scott's point about that, is that they talk about how like wellness areas are on an uptick, but not in the North American market.
Yeah.
But wellness areas where like communal experiences with people, and like places where you wrap in some sort of wellness thing into an FEC or into even a theme park.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that what is going to be appealing to the market it has shifted since COVID, and I don't think we know exactly what that is yet. I do know that we need to certainly look at creature comfort in the parks, and especially because so many of the parks, when they are trying to justify why their numbers are not where their investors want them to be, is because of weather. I think that's very, very important. But going back to what we were talking about earlier, we'll see how the diversification of climate for Six Flags, we'll see how that helps or hinders them as a company as a whole.
There was a section for weather in the report, but it really didn't talk about anything, which, even reports like this are political in their way. So I'm not, so I think that might have been a weird, not sure how to put it, basically politically, but they did just mention that like a potential strategy, right, could be Six Flags' strategy of just having parks in different areas, because then, if you have some parks that are shut down, then other parks are open, and it could help you diversify your revenue. But they didn't square that with the concept that clearly we're not diversified, because the vast majority of the tourism in the United States is just on two coasts, right? Like we see the map right there. So they didn't really square that circle in the report.
And going back to what we talked about, or going back to the UAE, which we mentioned, earlier, all the parks in Yas Island are all indoors, because they learned from the Dubai parks, some of which have closed. Motion Gate is sucking wind. Of all of those parks that are outdoors, they realize they cannot operate them year round because they are just so incredibly uncomfortable. So they took, in the initial design, they took creature comfort, human comfort, the ability to be out in 120-degree heat into consideration in the actual construction of the parks. So I think as we look forward, more and more parks need to take that into consideration. Like Philip has mentioned, shaded areas, cooling areas, indoor areas, especially in the Florida market, because it's getting warmer and warmer.
Yep. The last section here to finish off that they mentioned in the trends, obviously inflation, which we talked about, increased costs, turning to automation to reduce staffing, which we've talked about ad nauseum as well. And then, of course, Halloween events have revolutionized the theme park calendar. Parks are trying to create that same level of demand through other special events held throughout the season. We talk about that a lot because it's exactly what we both work in, but that's exactly true, right? So have all these that balances out where they're trying to even out their shoulder seasons with other events to replicate Halloween. Although interesting in the past, at least this past year, where there's just been an interesting swing of the pendulum the other way, where they're starting to include Halloween in the same way they include Christmas, which would kind of be pushing it back the opposite direction.
Yeah, I will say that is a regional thing, because in Florida they're pushing it hard the other way. They're continuing to make it part of a separate ticketed admission, as we all know here. And again, it just kind of proves the point that Philip and I have talked about, again, way too much, is that Halloween is sort of the gateway drug to the seasonal event. And I think part of the reason that Halloween works so well as a separate ticketed event is because you can take your brand and show a different side of it. You can show a different facet. And everybody's been trying, as long as I've been in the industry, has been trying to find a way to recreate what Halloween does. And I think they've been trying too hard to find things that are too much like their day product. And I think they need to look more into things that are less like their day product to offer a more diverse overall offering, so they can bring in guests with different likes, different tastes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But once again, that in and of itself is a whole nother show. And this is not that show, because we are out of time. So on behalf of Philip Hernandez and myself, Scott Swenson, this is Green Tag Theme Park in 30, and we will see you next week.